Well, at first glance, you wouldn't think anything different of this place. You've got some nice green areas, you've got some residential housing and so on. But, most of the houses seem to be empty.
This is a place that really looks like it's seen better days, that it once used to just be full of activity, full of people, and now it just looks impoverished and just neglected.
But there's something else that's not quite right about these homes.
They all look the same inside. It almost looks industrial. So it's at odds with what you'd expect for that particular area.
Traces of protest mark these strangely uniform houses.
Something has happened here. It's not what it once was, and you can't help but wonder what happened to make it reach the state that it's in today.
It was really a hot mess of abandonment when I first came here.
Tim Sokolov first came here as a teenager.
Most of what we're seeing now, you couldn't see. It was overgrown. There were trees and brush everywhere.
Beneath the undergrowth, Tim found the houses were unusually distinctive.
Everything was minimalistic. There was no cabinets, cupboards. This was it. You had a sink and a shelf. This was your fuse box. It's a Frankenstein switch with 2 fuses that ran the whole apartment. And here, we got original bathroom and pipes all exposed. Toilet with the tank that had the connection. The tanks were actually made to the walls. And everybody looks here and they says, wow, how do you take a bath in that tub? Little 4-foot tub, cast iron.
But this neighborhood became home to poverty. And at number 50 Chambers Street, events turned tragic.
2 brothers lived in this apartment. They didn't have their water turned on because they didn't want to pay a water bill. They would go dumpster diving for food. And at one point in time, a neighbor had come over and knocked on the door. And when one brother opened the door, there were legs sticking out from behind the door because the other brother had just passed away, and he just, let him lay there.
Poverty had become the norm here by the time the brother died. But it didn't start out this way. These are the Sheet and Tube Company homes. Their story begins with the establishment of a steel mill in neighboring Youngstown.
Youngstown Sheet and Tube was one of the great iron and steel companies of the day. Remember, it's coming about just as the Industrial Revolution is growing in the United States.
But it goes on in the 20th century to become larger than Coca-Cola, larger than Heinz, larger than Johnson & Johnson. It becomes the 5th largest steel company in the United States and the largest employer in Youngstown.
But in 1915, the company hit its first major hurdle. Europe was in the grips of the First World War, an industry strained to make materials for battle.
The First World War has a really interesting impact on industry in the United States. It ramps up demand, and so it's actually good for business.
I mean, if you think about it, if you're making steel and iron, war is when demand's at its greatest. For the manufacturing industry, it's a boom time.
But while the company was making money, its employees were facing a war of their own.
Working conditions for these steel workers was not good. And then everything gets speeded up when the war begins. The workers are expected to do more and to work overtime.
There was no union yet, there was problems, and they weren't really trying to pay the guys what they should be paying them. So there was a lot of dissent that started to build.
Low pay and bad conditions created a pressure cooker, one that was about to blow.
In December 1915, 500 employees walk out, they put down their tools, they want better conditions, they want fair pay, they want better housing.
The labor strike continued for weeks. But after the new year, events came to a head.
On January 7th, 1916, the strikers, along with their wives, marched up Wilson Avenue to meet a group of scab workers who were coming in to try to take their jobs. That's when things get out of hand.
We're not sure who took the first shot, if it was one of the guards at the steel mill or if it was one of the people in the crowd, but a shot was fired and a riot broke out.
People rioted, they looted some of the buildings, burnt things and so on. And the next day, on the 8th, the Home Guard had to be called in to calm things down, and many of the workers were arrested and jailed.
This was the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Hospital. For some guys, it saved their life by getting right here to the hospital before they could bleed out or, their injury took their life.
The riot was a bloodbath.
By the time the dust is settled, 125 people are injured and 3 people are dead.
Tensions between employer and employee were higher than ever. So the company made an offer.
The mill workers rioted and burned the city to the ground. And the mill said, this is not conducive to our business model. We can't have this. Let's build them some nice homes that they can live in that will give them a better standard of living.
The company's solution was to seduce its employees with unrivaled new homes.
The housing was going to be connected to electricity. It was going to have running water. And so it was going to provide workers with amenities that were not yet fully standard in the United States.
The buildings were sold as homes of the future. But with the company's eye on the bottom line, these houses would have to be built on the cheap. Following a riot in 1916, Youngstown Sheet and Tube was forced to build company housing. But they didn't want to dig too deeply into their profits.
They came up with an ingenious way of doing that by building essentially prefabricated units. They were going to construct houses, one next to each other, that were all the same.
When this apartment complex was created, it stood for everything America stood for: strong, innovative, powerful. This was the epitome of modern building technology.
Entire walls were cast in low-cost concrete. When they arrived on site, they were assembled like flat-pack furniture.
The buildings went together, so when they put the next slab in, it slid right in there into that one, like a lock-in-place kind of Lego. And here's a section of wall. This was actually standing up against here when I first came here, and eventually fell over onto the ground. And when it hit the ground, it's so heavy that we heard it all the way up into the Union Square Park.
You expect cars to come off a production line, not houses, but here they'd flip that around and they were literally producing house after house after house after house, very quickly, very cheaply, but in doing so also creating a community that was desirable for the workers to want to go and move in.
The new homes put an end to the strike action.
But that meant that Youngstown were both employer but also landlord. So when something was going to go wrong, things were going to go badly wrong.
The company and the neighborhood prospered for 60 years. But on September 19, 1977, the steel mill closed down. 5,000 people lost their jobs overnight. It's still known as Black Monday.
And this has this huge ripple effect in the community. And when Black Monday happens, it's sort of the first in a series of plant shutdowns. And so you have this depopulation that starts to happen in the late 70s into the 80s. When you think about the decline of the Rust Belt, that's exactly what this moment is.